At its height, Rome held up to 1 million people, monumental architecture, aqueducts carrying fresh water for miles, roads spanning a continent. By 900 AD, that same city held roughly 30,000 inhabitants. Its forums lay overgrown, its aqueducts broken. Saracen pirates, the medieval term for Muslim North African raiders, had plundered the city in 843. Rome lost 97% of its population. Europe was poorer, less educated, and more violent than it had been 7 centuries earlier. No rational observer would have bet on its future. Yet within 200 years, Europe launched armies to conquer Jerusalem. Within 500, a few hundred soldiers toppled empires spanning continents. To understand this improbable transformation, we first need to grasp how far Europe had fallen. The decline wasn't brief. It lasted 800 years. From roughly 200 to 1000 AD, population dropped across the entire continent. Rome's collapse from 1 million to 30,000 was extreme, but the trend was universal. Literacy plummeted. What learning survived became a monopoly of the church. Secular education vanished. Political order fragmented into weak local authorities ruling a heavily militarized, overwhelmingly rural society. Commerce shrank to a fraction of what Rome had sustained. This wasn't a temporary crisis. Generation after generation lived in a world that was measurably getting worse. Perhaps the most dramatic shift was geographic. The Mediterranean, once a unified Roman lake connecting Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, shattered into 3 hostile civilizational zones. The Islamic world controlled North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. Byzantium held the Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia. Latin Christendom, Western and Central Europe, was left with the smallest, poorest, least urbanized share. Europe wasn't just declining internally. It had been severed from the wealthiest, most sophisticated regions it once ruled. Europe's problems look even worse in global context. Around the year 1000, the Islamic world led in virtually every measure of civilizational achievement. Fatimid Egypt, the powerful Islamic state controlling Egypt and much of North Africa, presided over vast wealth and sophisticated learning. Cordoba in Islamic Spain rivaled any city on earth. Islamic scholars preserved and extended Greek science, mathematics, and philosophy, while Western Europe had largely forgotten them. Byzantium remained a sophisticated imperial state, with Constantinople as the largest Christian city in the world. Meanwhile, Germany, France, Italy, and the British Isles looked deeply unpromising. Fragmented, rural, poor. If you were placing bets around the year 1000 on which civilization would dominate the next millennium, Western Europe would have been the longest of long shots, and yet it won. The answer lies in 3 foundations quietly being laid even during the centuries of decline. The first foundation, the end of invasions. The 10th century saw Europe besieged from 3 directions simultaneously. From the north came the Vikings, seafaring raiders who struck coastal and river settlements across the continent. From the east, the Magyars. Magyars is the self-designation of the people known externally as Hungarians, commonly but incorrectly linked to the Huns. They were fearsome mounted warriors who terrorized Central Europe throughout the 10th century. From the south, Saracen pirates raided the Mediterranean coast. Muslim North African naval forces bold enough to plunder Rome itself in 843. Europe faced existential threats from every direction. For a fragmented, weakened civilization, this looked like a death sentence. Here's the critical fact: the Vikings were the last major invaders of Western Europe. All 3 threats, Vikings, Magyars, Saracens, were neutralized or absorbed by the late 10th century. Eastern Europe would face the Mongols centuries later, devastating Polish and Hungarian armies in the 1200s. But the West was spared. The cessation of invasions enabled population growth, better harvests, and improved nutrition, whether from more settled conditions, a warming climate, or simple human resilience. For the first time in centuries, Europe could grow instead of merely survive. With invasions ending, Europe could begin to grow, but growth alone doesn't build a civilization. What gave Europe coherence was its second foundation, Christianization. In the 10th and early 11th centuries, a wave of conversions swept Europe's periphery. Scandinavia, Iceland, Bohemia, roughly the modern Czech Republic, Hungary, and Russia all adopted Christianity. This was far more than a change of religion. Christianization functioned as a civilizational operating system. It drew formerly external peoples into a shared cultural sphere, creating political alliances, trade networks, diplomatic protocols, and a common intellectual language. It served simultaneously as a marker and an engine of economic development. By the year 1000, the concept of Christendom had emerged, not just a faith, but a cultural and political identity for an entire civilization. Christianity gave Europe a shared identity. What gave that identity depth and ambition was something older, the enduring legacy of Rome. Despite centuries of decline, Rome never fully died. Three continuities persisted. First, Latin, still the dominant language of learning and administration in the year 1000, providing an intellectual common tongue across a fragmented continent. Second, Roman architectural ideals, Romanesque architecture, the building style of the 11th and 12th centuries, named for its direct debt to Roman principles, filled Europe with churches that physically asserted continuity with Rome. Third, the idea of empire itself. In 962, Otto I was crowned Roman emperor by the Pope in Rome. His empire centered on Germany, but the institution endured roughly 850 years until Napoleon abolished it in 1804. The conviction that a Roman Empire should exist in Europe never died. End of invasions, Christianization, the legacy of Rome. Individually, each mattered. Together, they transformed a declining backwater into a civilization poised for takeoff. By the year 1000, something recognizable as Europe, beyond the mere geographical label, had come into being, not yet powerful, not yet wealthy, not yet learned by the standards of its rivals, but possessed of three decisive assets: security from external destruction, an integrating identity through Christianity, and the cultural memory of greatness through Rome. These were the hidden foundations. What rose from them was explosive. By 1095, European Christendom assembled a crusading army to take Jerusalem, unthinkable a century earlier. By the 1200s, universities emerged at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. By 1492, Spain and Portugal launched global colonial empires with astonishing speed, from Malaysia to Mexico to Peru. Within decades of Columbus, a few hundred soldiers toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, vast civilizations brought down by the descendants of that same impoverished, fragmented Europe of the year 1000. The journey from unable to defend its own borders to projecting power across the globe took just 5 centuries. The story of Europe from 200 to 1000 is a reminder that civilizational decline and civilizational foundation building can happen at the same time. What looks like an ending, 8 centuries of measurable collapse, can also be a beginning. The question is never just how far has this civilization fallen. It's always what is quietly being built in the ruins.